You will notice on the programme there is the magic word, cake. So I will not go on past 4 o'clock, I promise you, and I'll be the first out through the door. So this afternoon I want to not cover quite so much ground and focus in a little bit more depth on one particular issue. I'm calling this reading the scriptures backwards, although it's really reading the scriptures backwards and then forwards. And I will explain that as we go along. So I want to start with this text, which Walter Kaiser, the American Old Testament scholar, describes as the most important verse in the Old Testament. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your land and from your relatives and from your family to the land that I will show you, that I may make you a great nation, and bless you, and make your name great, and be a blessing, that I may bless those who bless you, but the one who disdains you I may curse, that all the clans of the earth will find blessing in you." So I just want to ask for a few minutes how we should read this text. And I want to start by reading it backwards. Reading Genesis backwards, because one of the things that we discuss when we look at the Pentateuch on the course here, and similar to LTS, is who wrote it. And I firmly believe that although making allowance for some later statements, such as Moses was the humblest man in the world, I don't think Moses wrote that, because it would then prove it not to be true, wouldn't it? So there are one or two places, and the description of Moses' death, and in Genesis you have a description of that before there were any kings in Israel. So there are statements that are added later on, but by and large it's from Moses. Moses wrote the Pentateuch. Most of it, from Exodus to Deuteronomy, he is the only main character, really. Only main human character, I should say, and a lot of it could not exist without him, because he was the only person who witnessed it. Therefore, you see, very often we have this debate, because of the history of scholarship since the middle of the 19th century onwards, all the debates about who wrote the Pentateuch, and it's been spliced and diced and all the rest of it. And so the evangelical response has been to say, no, we maintain Mosaic authorship. And that's all good and right. But what are the implications if Moses wrote this? And the first implication is it means we should read Genesis backwards. Genesis was written for the Sinai generation. Before it was written for anyone else, Moses had a purpose in putting Genesis together. I happen to believe that he used earlier sources to compile Genesis, but it was written for them, although it is, of course, for all believers of all time, including us. And it may interest you to know that Deuteronomy is the Old Testament book most quoted by the Lord Jesus in the quotations that we have from the Old Testament by him in the Gospels. So the Pentateuch is our book, but it wasn't written to us. It was written to the Sinai generation. So what does Genesis look like then for one of those first Israelites who came out of slavery in Egypt, delivered through the Red Sea, and meeting with God at Sinai? Let me just go back to Genesis 1 for a minute. Now, we've had mention of Edgar Andrews' book. Are there still some copies left? Or have they all gone? Yes, there are still copies left. And that's a very good and helpful and mind-pummeling book, if you don't mind me saying so. I find it very challenging. But it's engaging with all sorts of scientific questions that are current today about the origin of the universe and so on. It's very good and helpful and necessary. But those weren't the issues for the Sinai generation. What were the issues for them? What does Genesis 1 and 2 read like for the Sinai generation? And for them, it establishes the idea, a fundamental, massive idea, that the whole of creation is essentially a temple. And when you compare the description of, in the book of Exodus, of the pattern that God gave for the construction of the tabernacle and all its paraphernalia, and then later on all that repeated in the actual construction of the tabernacle and all its vessels and its service and so on, there are some striking similarities with the account of the creation of the universe in Genesis chapter 1. I haven't got time to go into all this now, but this is a very current thing, or has been for the last 20 or 30 years in Old Testament scholarship. So you have, for example, cherubim guarding the way to the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3, and similarly you have cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant. You have cherubim embroidered on the veil that screens off the presence of God in the Holy of Holies. You have the lampstands in the tabernacle, which many people think symbolically represent the tree of life. And to summarize it all on this diagram, if you take a sort of a plan of the tabernacle, and the tabernacle is the same plan as the temple, only the temple was twice as big, and then instead of it being flat, you turn it vertical, you have a picture of the universe. So the Holy of Holies represents the heavens where God dwells. The holy place represents the earth, and if you remember in the temple and in the tabernacle, it's all embroidered with plant life. And then below that you have the sea, which is the name for the big bronze thing full of water outside the tabernacle. Underneath that, and that's a very simple picture of how the ancient Near Eastern people saw the cosmos. So the temple is a cosmos, and the cosmos is a temple. And this would have resonated with the Sinai generation for reasons which I'll go on to explain a bit more later. And then you look a bit further and you find it on the fourth day in Genesis chapter 1 that the sun and the moon are placed in the sky. And why are they placed there? To give light, yes, but also to measure time. That's why they're there, to give us days and years and months. And the words used in Genesis 1 about that time are the same words used in elsewhere in the Pentateuch to describe the Jewish festivals, the times, the appointed times when they had festivals. And of course, why did God create in 6 days? He created in 6 days because of the seventh day. It's interesting, if you go back to the Reformation, Calvin and Luther, for example, were quite novel in arguing for a literal 6-day creation, because most of the people in those days believed in a one-day creation. The question that they were facing was, why did it take God so long as 6 days? And the reason why God took 6 days is to establish the pattern of 1 day in 7 as a day of worship. So it's all about Sabbath. The 7 days are all about Sabbath. And of course the Sabbath is a perpetual thing which the people of Israel have to observe. It's one of the 10 words, the 10 commandments that they're given. And it runs through the whole of their lives. And so then, if this is the case, then you can see that Eden is a kind of sanctuary. And Adam has a priestly role. And he is placed in the garden to keep and to serve it. And those two words, the two verbs conjoined, keep and serve, are what the Levites do with the tabernacle later on in the Pentateuch. So Adam's priestly role is taken on to some extent by Abraham and the patriarchs, and then by Israel, who in Exodus 19 are described as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So the picture is this, that the world is created by God to be a temple, a place where he is worshipped, a place of fellowship between man and God. That, of course, all goes horribly wrong in Genesis 3. And therefore, from Genesis 3 onwards, there is the need to restore that fellowship, for there to be some place of access for human beings, some means by which fellowship between man and God can be restored. And that is really the plot line of the rest of the Bible. And if you remember Revelation 22 ends up with a new Jerusalem coming out of heaven, and now the dwelling of God is with men. Finally, we've reached the answer. And so, when we look at the Pentateuch on the course here, sometimes I've said, some people have said you can divide the Bible into two. Genesis 1 and 2, and then Genesis 3 to Revelation 22. because you've got the perfect state with the world as a cosmos for 2 chapters in Genesis, and then the rest of the Bible story is how we get back there. Sorry, I'm forgetting my slides. So, there is a theme to the Pentateuch, because another consequence of a single author, a Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, is that there is a theme running through it. Interesting, one of the people who has opposed the documentary hypothesis that the Pentateuch was written at all sorts of different times by different people with different perspectives, a man called Wybray, who's not an evangelical, but he says the problem with that is, if that were how the Pentateuch came together, there would be no coherent story. Because if you take 4 books randomly off the bookshelf there, pay for them first, and then cut them up and stick them together, you're not going to get a coherent book. But there is a coherent theme running through the Pentateuch. And it is of God's purpose for the whole of the world. And this is why Genesis 12 verse 3 is so important. In you, Abraham, all nations of the earth, all clans of the earth, literally, will find blessing. So the theme of the Pentateuch is that God cares about the whole world. He has a mission to the whole world, a plan and a purpose for the whole world, which is going to be accomplished by his call of a particular people in Abraham. And that's the message of the Pentateuch. And here's an interesting detail. In Genesis 10, you have something called the Table of Nations, a list of all the people groups and language groups in the ancient world. And there are 70 names. And then in Genesis 46, you have a list of all the children of, or relatives of Jacob who went down into Egypt. And there are 70 names. And it's been suggested, and I think this is probably quite compelling, that that is not a coincidence, that it's quite deliberate. And it is deliberately drawing a comparison, making a connection between the people of Israel and the rest of the world. And then we come to Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, and this intriguing phrase, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, so God separates out all the peoples in the world and gives them a place to live and so on. When he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. And again, many people would say there's something going on in that verse to suggest that there is some kind of a correspondence between the nation of Israel and the rest of the world. Peter's heard all this before, haven't you? Because we did it in a biblical theology day at LTS on Thursday, which just bears out what he said, that everything you've heard, you hear it again if you come to EMF, but maybe a little bit more. So, Abraham's call is a call of a particular people. I will make you a great nation, but it's also a call that is designed for the blessing of all the nations. And the immediate impact of this in the second half of chapter 12 is that there is a famine in the land, and Abraham goes down to Egypt. So the first interaction between Abraham, who is of course going to become Israel, is with Egypt. Highly significant. And the interaction with Egypt illustrates the blessing-cursing, because when the Egyptians take Abraham's wife for them, then they suffer. And when she is restored to them, they receive blessing. And so we see the beginnings, even in the second half of that very same chapter, of this important interplay between Abraham and his family and the nations of the world. Now, I haven't got time to explore that too much further, except to say, in chapter 16 then, you get the incident with Hagar and Ishmael. Remember, of course, Sarah can't have children. She and Abraham are way beyond the age of bearing children. They get very frustrated with this. God gives a promise. They wait. In Hebrew, hoping and waiting is the same verb. So they wait. And eventually they say, well, let's take matters into our own hands. So Sarah gives Abraham her maidservant, for him to sleep with, and she is Hagar from Egypt. And when her son Ishmael grows up, she gets an Egyptian wife for him. And at various times there's a famine in the land of Canaan, but there's grain in Egypt. And so all the way through the Abraham narratives, remember you're a Sinai generation reading this, reading Genesis backwards, and you think, yes, this is resonating with me now, because Egypt is presented as a fertile alternative to God's plans. Egypt is the easier, more obvious way, apparently, of securing the blessing and the fruitfulness. But that's not the way to go. So then we get Joseph in Egypt. And of course, he is sold into slavery in Egypt. Sinai generation. It's resonant, isn't it? But he is also a channel of God's blessing to Egypt, to those who bless him. Remember what God said to Abraham, those who disdain you I will curse, but those who bless you I will bless. So someone like Potiphar, who shows favour to Joseph, recognises his integrity and so on, places him over his entire household, his household prospers. Later on, Joseph rises to that position of prominence in Egypt, and Pharaoh says, right, I'll set you over the whole of Egypt, you'll be second only to me in the whole kingdom, and Egypt prospers. Those who bless you, I will bless. And then, of course, it's not just Egypt, it's all nations. Genesis 41 verse 57, at the height of the famine, let me just find this. Genesis 41:57, the end of the chapter there, all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was so severe in all the lands. All nations came to Joseph in Egypt. And so Joseph's being in Egypt, we're very familiar with what Joseph said at the end of Genesis, you meant it for harm, but God meant it for good. We're very familiar with the idea of Joseph's being in Egypt as being the means of the salvation of Jacob and all his descendants. But I remember being mind-blown when I read this on the train in Anglo-Saxon by somebody called Aelfric the Grammarian. What a name. And 1,000 years ago, he saw this. He said, Joseph was there as the means for the salvation of Egypt. Wow, that's big, isn't it? And not just Egypt, but everybody else as well. The whole world was saved from the famine because Joseph was there. So now let's read Exodus forwards in the light of this. Israel in Egypt. First of all, we have the fulfillment of, I will curse those who disdain you, because a new Pharaoh comes onto the throne who did not know Joseph. And I think probably what that means is we have a dynasty change. A new dynasty comes to power in Egypt, not familiar with Joseph's special relationship with Pharaoh, and they start to oppress the Hebrews. And because of that, they will be cursed, because they have treated God's people this way. Now, we're familiar with the idea of the plagues as plagues. We're familiar with the idea that God sent these plagues as a judgment, and it is a judgment. And the Hebrew text does use the word plague, but it also uses, more often, the terms signs and wonders for those 10 events in the book of Exodus. Now, why is that? It's because they are revelation. They are revelation. They're not primarily about punishment. They are about revelation. God is revealing himself to the Egyptians. And in fact, 8 times in the book of Exodus, we have this phrase, that they may know, during the plague narratives. That they may know. And I'm just going to read you a couple of them from chapter 9, Exodus 9, the more significant telling comments. Exodus 9:16 is the first one. But indeed, for this purpose I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you, and that my name may be declared in all the earth. And then chapter 9, verse 29, and Moses said to him, as soon as I've gone out of the city, I will spread out my hands to the Lord, the thunder will cease, and there will be no more hail, that you may know that the earth is the Lord's. So in all these events, yes, it is judgment on Pharaoh for his treatment of the Israelites, but beyond that it is revelation to Pharaoh and to all the nations of the world. And it follows on the back of, follows on the back of this statement. When Moses first went in with Aaron to Pharaoh and said, will you let the Hebrew people go a few days' journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to our God? And Pharaoh said, who is this Yahweh that I should let you do this? Who is he? Well, he spends the next 10 chapters finding out who God is. So it's not just judgment, it's about revelation of God to the nations. It's also a revelation to Israel, because as you read the book of Exodus, the first half of before you get to Sinai, it becomes obvious the Israelites didn't really know Yahweh at all. It says in chapter 3 that God acted. The people cried out. It doesn't say they cried to him. It says they cried out. And God looked upon the children of Israel. Why? Because he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So there is no relationship really between the people. And remember how when God appears to Moses in the burning bush, the question is, who am I going to tell them has sent me? And how am I going to convince them who you are? So the relationship doesn't really begin until Sinai. And so the events of their salvation, as God judges Egypt and eventually brings them out through the Red Sea, defeats Pharaoh, they stand still and see the deliverance of their God. All this is telling them who God is. Their salvation then becomes the message they have to proclaim to the world. And so, I'm now going to summarize the rest of the Old Testament in one diagram. It's the sort of thing I do. My son tells me I have weirdness issues. That's fine. So, Israel is a little tiny nation. It's a tiny, tiny group of people. And they are placed in a little tiny strip of land, really. You can see where it says Canaan there. In this massive world, and in this massive world, you can see some of the other peoples who are mentioned in the Old Testament. So why is Israel given this little bit of land here? Because it's a corridor. It's the corridor through which everybody is travelling. If you want to get from Mesopotamia into Egypt and vice versa, you've got to go through this little corridor called Canaan. So it is in exactly the right place for Israel to have maximum contact with and therefore influence and impact over the other nations. This is in God's plan. He put them there in the middle of the world so that the world will come to them. And the world does come to them. And I think the plan would be that, and we see this to some extent with David and Solomon, that as Israel is prosperous and faithful to the Lord, he extends the borders of Israel and they have more and more influence and impact in the world around them. When they start to disobey the covenant and they become an apostate nation, it works the other way around. The nations come to them. Yes, they come as God's judgment, but they also go away with some contact with God. And so this is my diagram summarizing the rest of the Old Testament. It's a little bit like ripples in a pond. The oval on the left-hand side there is Israel in Egypt, and then it comes, and initially it's Israel in Canaan, and their contact with and impact on the Canaanites. And then as the book of Judges unfolds, the contact is wider with Moab and Philistia and Ammon and Midian, the nations around them. And then you go on a little bit further into the book of Samuel and Kings, and suddenly Syria or Aram is a threat. And in the days of Elijah and Elisha, you get Naaman the Syrian coming to a knowledge of the true living God because of that contact. Then it goes a bit further in the days of Isaiah, Hezekiah. Assyria, the great world power, gets its teeth into Israel, but also contact with the Israelites. Then in the next century, in the days of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, it's Babylon, further and further afield. And remember how Daniel is there in the powerhouse, in the court of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, saying there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries and explains to Nebuchadnezzar where he fits into the world and God's plan. And then after that we have Persia. And in the intertestamental period, we have Greece and Rome. See? I would come and listen to your any day of the week, talking about the intertestamental period. And so, as we read this forward, we see that Israel is given this role as a royal priesthood. To whom are they priests? They are priests to the world. And their function is to spread this light throughout the whole world. And God will make it happen whether they are obedient or disobedient. And then we find in the Psalms this universalism. It's not a faith that is confined within the borders of Israel, and God is not a God who only operates within the borders of Israel. He is a universal God, God of all mankind. Psalm 96, verse 1. Oh, sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Sing to the Lord, bless his name. Proclaim the good news of his salvation from day to day. And more significantly, more pointedly, Psalm 67, verses 1 and 2. God be merciful to us and bless us and cause his face to shine upon us. That's, of course, based on the priestly blessing in number 6. Verse 2, that your way may be known on earth, your salvation among all nations. And similarly, in the prophets, you have a worldwide hope. A hope of the knowledge of God spreading throughout the whole world as the waters cover the sea. And particularly we see pictures of the nations coming to a renewed and restored Zion and coming and hearing the word of God from the Jewish people. And this all effected through the servant. Read the servant songs in Isaiah. It's not enough for you to be the Redeemer of Israel. I'm going to give you the nations, the islands, the ends of the earth as well. And the Davidic branch in Jeremiah. And the Spirit of God in Ezekiel, tying in with what you were saying about Pentecost. And so we're then hanging on the edges of our seat for 400 years after Malachi, waiting for this to be fulfilled and to come to fruition. And of course, it comes in Christ. And if you had had the privilege, as some of us did, to be at LTS last Thursday and hear Robert Strivens talking about the way, just taking us through Luke's Gospel and showing how many times the Lord Jesus challenges the Jewish people with the fact that God is come to save the Gentiles and the mission to the Gentiles. And it's no wonder they were angry with him at times, because some of the parables he told, how God had rejected Israel and the Gentiles were going to be saved. And then he gives, of course, the Great Commission to his people to go out into all the world and save people. Before that happens, there's this telling incident, isn't there? When he goes into the temple and he cleanses it, he throws out all the people who were changing money and selling sacrifices and just making religion generally more convenient for people. And I understand that was a relatively new innovation at that time. And of course, where were they doing it? They had been doing it apparently on the Mount of Olives. But now they'd started doing it in the temple precincts itself. And the area where they'd set up shop was the court of the Gentiles. And remember how Jesus says, the Bible says, my house will be a house of prayer for all nations, but you have turned it into a den of thieves. And so the issue there is the lack of missionary concern at all. We don't need this court for the Gentiles because we're not really bothered whether they come or not. Let's use it for ourselves to make religion more convenient. So, how is this then fulfilled in the church? It's fulfilled in the church in a few ways. First of all, we are Christians because of Genesis 12, verse 3. If you're a Christian here today, and you're not Jewish, as I guess most of us aren't, it is because of Genesis 12, verse 3, because in Abraham all nations of the earth will find blessing. Salvation is of the Jews. The second point is that wonderful priestly role that was given to Israel in Exodus 19 is given away by the Apostle Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2. It's amazing how he gives away all the family silver in this book, because he's writing to Christians. Some were Jewish, many were probably not. And he says, you are now the temple. You are now the priesthood and the sacrifices at the same time. And he goes on to say, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people. Those are the terms of Exodus 19, and Peter here is giving them to Christians. That you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvellous light. Just as the Israelites were saved, and that salvation that they experienced became their missional message, it's the same for Christians, isn't it? That is our message. Our priestly role among the nations. Our salvation is for the benefit of the many. So, mission, it seems to me, looking through all this, is not an optional part. Actually, it's not even part of the Christian faith, because it is the Christian faith. Because God is a missional God. The whole story of the Bible is a story of a mission of God seeking and saving the nations. And at the end of Revelation, we have that great multitude that no one could count of people from every tribe and language and people group in heaven. So the God of the Bible is a missional God. The Bible's message is a missional message to seek lost humanity. And the election of some is for the salvation of the many. And so therefore, it seems to me, as Christians, we should be mission-hearted because God is mission-hearted. And I find this extremely challenging because I live in a world in which people don't want to know, and people are indifferent, and people become hostile if I try and tell them. Nevertheless, I must be mission-hearted. Now, whether that means I am involved in some kind of official, formal Christian service with a name and a label and maybe even a salary, or not, it doesn't matter really. Every one of us here must be mission-hearted because God is mission-hearted. And I think there's also a challenge, and that is to think about the first century Jewish authorities who had permitted the clogging up of the court of the Gentiles with religious paraphernalia. And there's a challenge in that for us. Let's not clog up, if you like, the court of the Gentiles, the access that people have to God with all our religious paraphernalia. Let's not be so into church and Christendom and so on that we're actually putting closing doors. We are supposed to be, the church is the place where people have access to God. And let's make sure that the doors are open and the pathways are clear so that people can get to God. Thank you. So I think we're going to sing now a very appropriate hymn, number 402.